The sky above Vistara Prime burned red with smoke and fire. Commander Alexis Carter stood at the broken window of what used to be the most secure building on the planet. Her hands gripped the metal frame as she watched the city below fall apart. Buildings that had stood for hundreds of years now lay in pieces. The beautiful crystal towers that once reached toward the stars were now nothing but sharp. Glass scattered across empty streets. 3 months ago, this war seemed impossible to lose. The Kalari Federation had the best weapons in the galaxy. Their energy shields could stop anything. Their ships moved faster than light itself. They had never lost a major battle in over 200 years, but none of that mattered now. The enemy was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. They called themselves the Void Swarm, but most people just called them the Bugs. They looked like giant insects, but they were much worse than any bug from Earth. These creatures could think together as one mind. When one learned something, they all learned it. When one died, the others knew exactly how it happened and made sure it would not happen again. The Kalari had tried everything. They used their best energy weapons, but the Bugs adapted. They built stronger shields, but the Bugs found ways around them. They changed their battle plans, but somehow the Bugs always knew what was coming next. It was like fighting an enemy that could read their minds. Carter turned away from the window and walked back to the command center. The room was much darker than it should be. Half the lights had been destroyed in the last attack. The walls showed cracks from the constant bombing. Computer screens flickered with bad news from across the planet. General Zethkar stood in the center of the room. His body was made of living crystal, like all Kalari. But his usually bright blue glow had faded to almost nothing. His 6 arms moved slowly across the control panels, but Carter could see that he was losing hope. "Report," Carter said, though she already knew the news would be bad. "The northern cities have fallen," Zethkar said without looking up. "The Bugs broke through our last defensive line 2 hours ago. We have no contact with our forces there." His voice was flat, empty of emotion. Carter looked at the main display screen. Red dots covered most of the planet map. Each red dot meant the Bugs had taken that area. The blue dots that showed where the Kalari forces still fought were getting smaller and fewer every hour. "What about the evacuation ships?" Carter asked. Zethkar's crystal body dimmed even more. "Gone. The last transport left orbit yesterday. Morning, the Bugs destroyed it before it could jump to light speed. There are no more ships coming." Carter felt her stomach drop. 40 million people still lived in the capital city of Lysander. Men, women, and children who had nowhere to run. The Bugs did not take prisoners. They did not make deals. They just consumed everything in their path. "How long do we have?" she asked. 6 hours, Zethkar replied. "Maybe less. Outer defenses are already falling. The Bugs will reach the city center by evening." The building shook as another explosion went off nearby. Dust fell from the ceiling. Through the walls, they could hear the distant sound of weapons fire. But the shooting was getting closer. Carter walked to another screen that showed the space above the planet. Black shapes moved between the stars like a swarm of angry wasps. Those were the Bug ships, more than anyone could count. They had surrounded the entire planet. Nothing could get in or out. "Your people fought well," Carter said to Zethkar. She meant it. The Kalari had been brave. They had stood their ground when other species ran away. They had shared their technology freely with their allies. They had been good friends to humanity for over 300 years. "It was not enough," Zethkar said. "We were not prepared for an enemy like this. Our weapons, our tactics, our way of thinking, none of it works against them." Carter understood what he meant. The Kalari fought with honor. They followed rules of war that had worked for centuries. They gave warnings before attacks. They tried. To avoid civilian areas, they treated prisoners fairly. These were good things, but they meant nothing to the Bugs. The Bugs fought like a force of nature. They did not care about honor or rules. They attacked hospitals and schools. They used dirty tricks and surprise attacks. They threw millions of their own soldiers away just to learn how their enemies fought. It was a way of war that civilized species could not understand. Another explosion shook the building, stronger this time. The lights went out for several seconds before the backup power kicked in. When they came back on, the screens showed even more red dots on the map. "Commander," one of the Kalari officers called out. His voice was full of panic. "Long-range sensors show a massive bug formation moving toward the city. Estimated arrival time is 4 hours." Carter closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Had seen wars before, but nothing like this. She had watched planets fall to invasion, but never so completely. The bugs did not just conquer, they consumed. After they were done, there would be nothing left of Kalari civilization but empty space. She thought about Earth, far away in another part of the galaxy. The human fleet had tried to help, but they had their own problems. The bugs were attacking. Human colonies, too. Earth could not spare many ships for a rescue mission that would probably fail anyway. The building shook again. This time, pieces of the ceiling fell down. One of the computer screens went dark. Through the broken window, Carter could see fires spreading across the city. The beautiful crystal buildings were melting under the heat of bug weapons. "General," she said to Zethkar, "gather all the civilians you can find. Bring them to the lower levels of this building. It is the strongest structure left in the city." Zethkar looked at her with his large, multifaceted eyes. "You know it will not matter. When the bugs arrive, they will tear through these walls like paper." "Maybe," Carter said, "but we are not dead yet. And as long as we are alive, we keep fighting." The Kalari general nodded slowly. It was not hope in his gesture, but it was something. Maybe it was just the refusal to give up without a fight. Outside, the sky grew darker as more bug ships moved. Overhead, soon the final battle for Vestara Prime would begin. And when it was over, one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy would be nothing but a memory. High above the burning planet, Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison sat alone in the cold metal box that would soon become his tomb. The drop pod was barely 8 feet long and 4 feet wide. It's just enough room for one soldier and his gear. The walls were thick steel covered with heat shields that would protect him during the fall through the atmosphere. If everything went right anyway, Morrison checked his rifle for the 20th time. The weapon was old by galactic standards. It fired simple metal bullets instead of energy beams. Most alien species thought human weapons were primitive and outdated. They preferred clean energy weapons that could be adjusted for different targets. Morrison preferred something that would punch holes in whatever he pointed it at. The ship around him was dying. The USS Defiant had been a good ship once, but 3 days of fighting had torn it apart. Most of the crew was dead. The engine room was on fire. Half the weapons were offline. Captain Lisa Hayes had died 2 hours ago when a bug plasma blast burned through the bridge. "Jake, you still awake in there?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Ryan Cole, the only other person left alive on the ship. He was running what was left of the bridge by himself. "Still here, Ryan?" Morrison replied through his helmet radio. "How bad is it out there? Bad enough? The bugs have us surrounded. I count at least 50 of their bioships in close range. More coming all the time." Ryan's voice was tired. He had been awake for 3 days straight, keeping the ship together with spare parts and prayer. Morrison looked through the small window in his drop pod. Space around the planet was full of enemy ships. They looked like giant insects made of black metal and living tissue. Some were the size of city blocks. Others were small and fast, darting around like angry wasps. All of them wanted to kill anything human they could find. "What are our chances of getting out of here?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. "0, Ryan said without hesitation. "Main engines are gone. Hyperdrive is fried. We have maybe an hour before the bugs finish us off." Morrison nodded to himself. He had known this was a one-way trip when he volunteered. The plan was simple. Drop down to the planet's surface. Find any survivors from the Kalari Federation. Get them to safety. The problem was that there was no safety left in this part of the galaxy. "Tell me about the target area," Morrison said. Ryan's fingers tapped across his control board. "The Kalari. Command bunker is in the center of their capital city. Heavy bug presence all around it. Sensors show maybe 200 Kalari still alive down there. They are trapped and running out of time. Any friendly forces on the ground?" "Negative. The Kalari military was wiped out yesterday. You will be going in alone." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. alone against a million bugs. Sounds like fun. He checked his other equipment. Grenades, ammunition, medical supplies, and enough food for 3 days. Not that he expected to live that long. His armor was basic ceramic plates over Kevlar. Nothing fancy, but it would stop most small arms fire. The bugs preferred energy weapons, so his armor might actually work better than the advanced stuff other species used, Jake Ryan said, and his voice was softer now. You know this is suicide, right? Even if you make it to the ground alive, even if you find the survivors, how are you going to get them out? We have no extraction plan. Morrison was quiet for a moment. He thought about his sister back on Earth. She was a teacher in a small town in Kansas. She probably did not even know there was a war going on. He thought about his friends from basic training. Most of them were dead now, killed on other worlds in other hopeless battles. Someone has to try, he said finally. Those people down there have been our allies for 300 years. They shared their technology with us. They helped us build better ships and weapons. They stood with us when the bugs first attacked human colonies. I am not going to let them die alone. Ryan was quiet for a long moment, and he said, "Copy that. Sergeant, drop pod is armed and ready. Launch in 60 seconds. Morrison sealed his helmet and felt the familiar weight of his full combat gear. The drop pod was cramped, but he had done this dozens of times before. Never over a planet full of hostile aliens, but the basic idea was the same. Fall fast, hit hard, and try not to die on impact. 30 seconds, Ryan announced. Through his tiny window, Morrison could see the planet getting larger. The surface was covered with fires and smoke. What had once been a beautiful world was now a battlefield. The bugs were good at destroying things. 10 seconds. Morrison grabbed the safety handles and braced himself. Drop pod launches were violent even under the best conditions. This was not going to be the best conditions. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Launch. The drop pod shot out of the USS Defiant like a bullet from a gun. Morrison felt his body pressed into his seat as the pod accelerated away from the dying ship. Through the window, he watched the Defiant shrink behind him. Ryan would keep the ship together as long as he could, maybe long enough to provide cover. Fired during the drop, the planet rushed up to meet him. Atmosphere grabbed the pod and shook it like a toy. The heat shields glowed red hot as they burned through the air. Bug interceptor ships tried to grab him, but the pod was too small and too fast. It cut through their formations like a knife. Morrison watched the ground get closer and closer. He could see the capital city now, or what was left of it. Smoke rose from 1,000 fires. Dark shapes moved through the streets like a living carpet. The bugs were everywhere. His target was a cluster of crystal buildings in the city center. That was where the Kaleri were making their last stand. That was where he would land, right in the middle of hell itself. The drop pod hit the atmospheres, lower levels, and began to slow down. Parachutes deployed automatically, but Morrison was still falling fast. The ground rushed up at him, and he could see individual bugs scattering as his pod screamed toward them. Impact in 10 seconds. Time. To see if human engineering was as tough as they claimed, Morrison gripped his rifle and prepared to fight. The drop pod hit the ground like a meteor. The impact crater was 20 feet wide and 5 feet deep. Smoke rose from the twisted metal as the pod cooled from its burning trip through the atmosphere. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the distant sound of weapons fire and the crackling of flames. Then the explosive bolts fired with a loud bang. The pod door flew off and landed 30 feet away with a crash that echoed through the crystal courtyard. Jake Morrison rolled out of the smoking pod, his rifle already in his hands. His body hurt from the impact, but he was alive and ready to fight. The first thing he noticed was the smell. The air was thick with smoke and something else, something sweet and rotten. It was the smell of death, of a city that was dying. The second thing he noticed was the silence. No birds sang.
Ow.
No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed afraid to make noise. Morrison looked around the courtyard. The Kalari command bunker rose in front of him, a massive structure made of blue crystal. That reached toward the sky. The walls were cracked and broken, but the building still stood. That was good. It meant people might still be alive inside. The third thing Morrison noticed was movement. Dark shapes were creeping toward him from all directions. They moved wrong, not like any animal he had ever seen. Their legs bent at impossible angles, their heads turned too far around. They made clicking sounds with their mouths that sent chills down his spine. These were the bugs. Up close, they were even worse than the intelligence reports had described. They were the size of large dogs, but they moved like spiders. Their skin was black and shiny, like oil. Their eyes were huge and multifaceted, like a fly's eyes, but bigger than dinner plates. When they opened their mouths, Morrison could see rows of sharp teeth that gleamed with saliva. The bugs had been studying the drop pod, trying to understand what it was. They had never seen human technology before. Most species in the galaxy used energy weapons and force fields. The bugs had learned to defend against those things. But a simple metal box that fell from the sky was something new. Morrison counted at least 30 bugs moving toward him. More were coming from the streets beyond the courtyard. They moved cautiously, like predators stalking prey. They were smart enough to be careful, but not smart enough to be afraid. "Time to introduce myself," Morrison said to himself. He raised his rifle and fired. The sound was like thunder in the quiet courtyard. The bullet hit the lead bug in the center of its head and blew it apart. Black blood sprayed across the crystal ground. The bug fell and did not move again. The other bugs stopped moving. They had never heard a sound like that before. Energy weapons were quiet, just a soft hum and a flash of light. This was different. This was loud and violent and primitive. Morrison fired again and again. Each shot was a thunderclap that echoed off the crystal walls. Each bullet found its target and dropped another bug. The creatures started to panic. They were used to adapting. 2 new weapons, but how do you adapt to a chunk of metal moving faster than sound? The bugs charged. Morrison kept firing. His rifle held 30 rounds, and he made each one count. The bugs fell in rows, their black blood pooling on the crystal ground. But more kept coming. There were always more. When his rifle ran empty, Morrison dropped the magazine and slammed in a new one. The reload took less than 3 seconds. The bugs were close now, close enough that he could smell their breath. It smelled like rotting meat and sulfur. Morrison pulled a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and threw it into the largest group of bugs. "Fire in the hole," he shouted, even though no one could hear him. The explosion was enormous. The grenade was filled with metal fragments that spread out in all directions. The bugs did not have armor that could stop shrapnel. They were built to absorb energy, not to deal with flying pieces of metal. 15 bugs died in the blast. The others scattered, confused and afraid. Inside the bunker, Commander Carter felt the building shake from the explosion. Then she heard something that made her heart race. The sound of human weapons. She knew that sound from joint training exercises. It was the bark of an assault rifle and the boom of a grenade. "What was that?" Shet shouted over the noise. "General." Zethkar was staring at his sensor readings. His crystal body was glowing brighter than it had in days. That impact in the courtyard, it was not a bug weapon. It was something else, something that fell from orbit. Carter ran to the window that looked out over the courtyard. Through the smoke and dust, she could see a figure in dark armor moving between the dead bugs. The figure was human-sized and human-shaped, carried a rifle that spat fire and death. "Possible," she whispered. Outside, Morrison was reloading again. It killed more than 40 bugs, but more were coming. They poured out of the surrounding. Buildings like water from a broken dam. Some flew through the air on wings that buzzed like giant wasps. Others crawled along the walls like spiders. Morrison pulled out his grenade launcher. It was a simple weapon, basically a tube that shot explosive shells. He aimed at a group of flying bugs and fired. The shell exploded in midair, sending metal fragments in all directions. The flying bugs fell like stones. "It's his staff sergeant." "Morrison, United States Colonial Marines," he said into his radio. "I am at the Kaleri command bunker. Is anyone alive in there?" For a moment, there was only static. Then Carter's voice came through, full of disbelief. "Morrison, how did you get here? We thought the human fleet was destroyed. Most of it was, ma'am, Morrison replied, as he shot another bug. But I am still here, and I am not leaving without you. The bugs were learning. They were staying farther away now, trying to circle around him. But Morrison had trained for this. He moved to the bunker entrance and put his back to the wall. Now they could only attack from one direction. He pulled out more grenades and set them around the entrance. The bugs wanted to get to the people. Inside, they would have to go through him first. And Jake Morrison was not an easy man to kill. Morrison crouched behind a broken piece of crystal wall and watched the bugs regroup. They were learning from their mistakes. The first wave had charged straight at him and died quickly. Now they were being more careful. They spread out in a wide circle around the bunker, staying just out of range of his grenades. But being careful was not going to save them. Morrison had been fighting wars since he was 18 years old. He had fought on jungle planets where the trees tried to eat you. He had fought in space stations where a single hole in the wall meant everyone died. He had fought in cities, in deserts, in places so cold that your breath froze before it left your mouth. The bugs thought they were smart because they could adapt to new weapons. But Morrison had something they could never adapt to. He had experience. He pulled out a small metal cylinder from his pack. It looked like a soup can, but it was much more dangerous. Inside was white phosphorus, a chemical that burned so hot it could melt steel. The Kaleri would never use a weapon like this. It was too crude, too destructive. But Morrison was not Kalari. He pulled the pin and threw the canister into the middle of the bug formation. It exploded with a bright white flash. The burning phosphorus scattered in all directions, sticking to everything it touched. The bugs screamed as the chemical ate through their shells. The sound was horrible, like metal being torn apart. The bugs that were not hit by the phosphorus started to panic. They had never faced a weapon that could not be stopped or adapted to. Fire was fire, or it burned everything the same way. Morrison used their confusion to move. He ran along the bunker wall, firing his rifle as he went. The bugs tried to follow him, but he was too fast. He knew exactly where he was going. He had studied the layout of the bunker before the drop. Every good soldier studies. It's the battlefield before the fight begins. He reached the corner of the building and pulled out another grenade. This one was different. Instead of metal fragments, it was filled with tiny ball bearings. When it exploded, it would send thousands of steel balls flying in all directions. The bugs would not know what hit them. The grenade went off with a sound, like thunder. The steel balls tore through the bug formation like a giant shotgun. 20 bugs fell at once, their bodies torn apart by the metal storm. Inside the bunker, General Zethkar was watching the human's helmet camera feed on his computer. The Kaleri had given Morrison a small transmitter so they could see what was happening outside. What they saw amazed them. "Your warrior fights like no one I have ever seen," Zethkar said to Commander Carter. "He does not follow any rules of combat. He uses weapons that we would consider barbaric." Carter smiled as she watched Morrison slide down a crystal pillar, shooting bugs with one hand while dropping grenades with the other. "He is fighting to win, General. Humans learned a long time ago that there is no such thing as a fair fight. There are only fights you win and fights you lose." On the screen, Morrison had reached another position. He was setting up what looked like a simple metal tube. Carter recognized it immediately. It was a rocket launcher, the kind that fired guided missiles. "What is he doing now?" Zethkar asked. Calling in air support, Carter replied. Morrison aimed the launcher at the sky and fired. The missile shot upward, leaving a trail of smoke behind it.
Above.
The planet, the USS Defiant, was still fighting. Lieutenant Ryan Cole saw the missiles. Signal and understood what Morrison wanted. "Hang on, Jake," Ryan said to himself. "Help is coming." The Defiant's main guns were still working, even if everything else was falling apart. Ryan aimed them at the coordinates Morrison had sent and fired. Tungsten rods, each one the size of a telephone pole, shot down from orbit at incredible speed. The kinetic bombardment hit the bug formations like the hammer of an angry god. The tungsten rods were moving so fast that they hit with the force of nuclear weapons. The ground shook. Buildings collapsed. A crater the size of a football field opened up where the bugs had been massing for their next attack. Morrison felt the shock wave knock him to his knees. His ears were ringing from the explosion. But when the dust cleared, he could see that the orbital strike had worked. Hundreds of bugs were dead. The survivors were scattered and confused. "Nice shooting, Ryan," Morrison said into his radio. "Glad I could help," Ryan replied. "But that was our last shot. The guns are overheating, and I do not have power for another bombardment." Morrison nodded. He had not expected the ship to last this long anyway. From now on, he was on his own again. The bugs were regrouping, but they were being more careful now. They had learned that this human had friends in orbit who could drop death from the sky. They were staying spread out, making small attacks instead of massing for a big assault. Morrison liked that even less. Big attacks were easy to stop with explosives. Small attacks meant he had to be everywhere at once. He was good, but he was not superhuman. He checked his ammunition. He'd used more than half of his bullets and most of his grenades. If the bugs kept coming at this rate, he would run out of weapons before he ran out of enemies. That was when Morrison noticed something strange. The bugs were not just attacking randomly. They were testing him. They would send a few bugs from one direction, then a few from another direction. They were learning how he fought, what weapons he used, how fast he could move. They were adapting, not to his weapons, but to him. Morrison realized he had a problem. The bugs were not stupid. They were learning his tactics just like they learned everything else. Soon they would figure out how to counter his moves. When that happened, he would be in real trouble. He needed to change his strategy. Instead of defending the bunker entrance, he needed to take the fight to them. He needed to do something they would not expect. Morrison pulled out his last white phosphorus grenade and his remaining rockets. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to attack. Morrison did something the bugs did not expect. Instead of staying near the bunker, he ran straight toward them. He charged into the largest group of enemies, firing his rifle and throwing his last grenades. The bugs scattered in confusion. They had been preparing for a defensive human, not one who attacked like a wild animal. Morrison rolled behind a fallen crystal pillar and checked his ammunition. He was down to his last magazine. After this, he would have to fight with his knife and whatever weapons he could take from dead bugs. Not a pleasant thought, but he had been in worse situations before. The bugs surrounded his position, but they were being careful. They had learned that getting too close to the human meant death. They stayed back and tried to shoot him with their bioweapons. Green acid splashed against the crystal pillar, eating holes in the ancient stone. Morrison waited for them to get closer. Patience was a human virtue that the bugs did not understand. They wanted to kill him quickly and move on to the bunker, but Morrison was willing to wait for the perfect moment. When the bugs finally charged, Morrison was ready. He threw his last white phosphorus grenade right into the middle of them. The burning chemicals scattered everywhere, turning the courtyard into a hellscape of fire and screaming aliens. Morrison used the confusion to run to a new position, but as he moved, something hit him hard in the back. He stumbled and fell, his rifle sliding across the ground. Behind him, a bug the size of a small car was pulling its claws out of his armor. The creature had been hiding underground, waiting for the right moment to strike. Morrison rolled away from the bug's second attack and drew his knife. The blade was only 8 inches long, but it was made of the hardest steel that human technology could produce. He had killed aliens with this knife before. The big bug lunged at him with claws that could tear through tank armor. Morrison ducked under the attack and drove his knife into the creature's throat. Black blood sprayed everywhere. The bug made a horrible gurgling sound and collapsed. Morrison retrieved his rifle. But when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The weapon was damaged from his fall. He threw it aside and picked up a piece of broken crystal. It was sharp enough to cut, and right now, that was all he needed. More bugs were coming. They poured out of every building, every street, every hole. In the ground, Morrison counted at least 200 of them. Even for a human, those were impossible odds. That was when he heard something beautiful. The sound of engines. Human engines. Morrison looked up and saw the most wonderful sight in the galaxy. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace above the planet. Lots of ships. The lead vessel was massive, bigger than anything the bugs had. On its side were the words USS Constitution and the flag of Earth. "This is Admiral Kate Sullivan of the Terran Defense Force," a voice said over Morrison's radio. "Sorry we are late to the party, Sergeant. We brought friends." The human fleet opened fire on the bug ships in orbit. Missiles and energy beams lit up the space around the planet. For the first time since the war began, the bugs were outnumbered, but Morrison was still surrounded on the ground. The bugs did not care about the space battle above them. They only cared about killing the human who had caused them so much trouble. Morrison backed toward the bunker entrance, was bleeding from several wounds, and his makeshift crystal weapon was starting to crack, but he was not giving up. Humans never gave up. The bunker door opened behind him. Commander Carter and General Zethkar came out, along with 50 Kaleri soldiers. They were carrying energy weapons and wearing battle armor. "We are here to help," Carter said as she shot down a flying bug. "About time," Morrison replied. He was breathing hard, but he was smiling. The Kaleri soldiers formed a defensive line around Morrison. Their energy weapons cut through the bugs like knives through paper. For the first time in hours, the bugs were the ones falling back. Above them, space battle was turning in favor of the humans. The bug ships were fast and deadly, but human ships were tougher. They could take more damage and keep fighting. More importantly, human captains fought dirty. They used ramming attacks and suicide runs that the bugs did not expect. One by one, the bug ships were destroyed or forced to retreat. Without support from orbit, the bugs on the ground started to lose their coordination. They were still dangerous, but they were no longer unstoppable. Morrison sat down on a piece of rubble and watched the human Marines land in the courtyard. They came down in drop pods just like his, but there were dozens of them. Each Marine carried the same primitive weapons that had served Morrison so well. Rifles that fired bullets, grenades that exploded with fire and metal. Simple weapons that worked. "Sergeant Morrison," Admiral Sullivan's voice came over his radio. "Outstanding work down there. We tracked your signal and followed it in. Saved a lot of lives today." Morrison looked around at the Kaleri survivors who were coming out of the bunker. Families with children, old people who had thought they would never see another sunrise. Soldiers who had given up hope. "Just doing my job, Admiral," Morrison said. General Zethkar approached Morrison and placed one of his crystal hands on the human's shoulder. "Your people have taught us something important today. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Sometimes crude weapons and dirty tactics are exactly what you need." Morrison nodded. The bugs spent so much time adapting to advanced weapons that they forgot how to deal with simple ones. A bullet is just a bullet. You cannot adapt to physics. Over the next few hours, more human ships arrived. They brought medical supplies for the wounded and transport ships for the survivors. The planet was saved, but more importantly, the galaxy had learned something new. Word spread quickly through the communication networks. The unstoppable void swarm had been stopped by human tactics. Other species began asking for human military advisors. They wanted to learn how to fight like humans. Morrison was taken to a medical ship to treat his wounds. As the doctors worked on him, he looked out the window at the human fleet. Ships from a dozen different worlds had come to help. They had not given up on their allies, even when the situation seemed hopeless. That was what made humans special, not their weapons or their technology, but their refusal to abandon their friends. In a galaxy full of advanced civilizations, sometimes the most important thing was simply being too stubborn to quit. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. The bugs would learn to fear the sound of human weapons. The galaxy would learn that sometimes being primitive was exactly what you needed to survive.